Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to show you 7 ways to make a lacing bar for a corset. Let's get into this. Alright, here we go. This is a panel that I draped. We are only going to focus on this piece right here. To make a lacing bar, you can make it with this piece or you can cut this piece into 2. So let's start with method 1, which is a 1-piece lacing bar. This method does not have seam allowance on the top or the bottom. Next is making a casing for a 1/4 boning. I always sew 3/8 to make a casing because a 1/2 inch will be too big and the boning will turn and turn in the casing, and you really don't want that. So on my machine, 3/8 is right here. Let's sew. Look how smooth it is once you put the boning in. No hassle. It's not tight and it's not big, so you see it's not going to turn. Even with interfacing, it goes in and out smooth. Next, sew a 1/2 inch here. Let's do some math real quick. 3/8 plus a 1/2 inch is what? 7/8, right? So look for the 7/8 over here. Let's sew. This is how it looks. We need one more casing, so let's sew 3/8 again. The 3/8 is at the edge of my foot, but check your foot too, okay? Because it might not be 3/8. Let's sew. The last thing to do for method 1 is cutting the boning to fit correctly inside. Cut off a 1/2 inch on the top and bottom of the boning. Then sew the bias binding a 1/2 inch on the top and the bottom. Here is the final look for method 1. This is the basic method, but it still makes your corset look good. Next is method 2. Cut the seam allowance only on the bottom of your pattern. Next, take the lining and turn it right side to right side. Sew the top and the center back. Leave the bottom open. Before you turn the fabric inside out, make sure you sew the corners a couple of times. You don't want the stitches to come apart when you clip it. This is the tool that I use to get sharp corners. It's called a point turner or a seam creaser. Push the fabric out, but don't push the tool too far because it can make a hole. Next, sew a casing for the boning. Let's sew. From here, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Remember, 3/8 and a 1/2 inch is 7/8. So we're going to find that 7/8 right here. Let's sew. This is how it looks. We need to do one more casing for the boning. Here is the boning. Put both of them in the casing. Cut them a 1/2 inch less than the center back length so you can have space to sew the bias tape. This is the final look for method 2. It's simple, but it's still pretty. Next is method 3. This is a 1-piece lacing bar. For this method, cut the seam allowance on the top and bottom only. From there, sew a 1/2 inch long stitch on the center back of your main fabric. How do you find the long stitch for a 1/2 inch? Well, this is what you do. Turn the length knob all the way to the highest number you have. Then for the width knob, move it till it reaches a 1/2 inch on your ruler, like this. Y'all know the drill. Let's sew. Now let's get a 1/2 inch bias tape and sew it right next to that line. Not on top of the line, but right next to it. The reason why I'm saying that is because when you sew the seam allowance, you will be sewing the bias tape too if you don't sew this next to it. If you sew it on top of it, and then when you sew the seam allowance, you're going to sew the bias tape too, and you don't want that. So just sew it right next to it. This is how it looks, and this is the back of the fabric. You see there's two lines. The first line is a long stitch, that's the seam allowance, and the second line is the bias tape that you just sewed. When you sew the seam allowance, it will not be attached to the bias tape. Let's sew the other side. Next, sew a 1/2 inch long stitch. But how do we do that? Let me show you. First thing we're going to do is change the length stitch button to the highest number. For the width button, you move it till you find the 1/2 inch from the edge of the bias tape like this. Let's sew. Get another piece of bias tape and sew it next to the line, not on top of the line. If you are sewing black bias tape, make sure the thread is black so that if you don't see the thread, you don't have to pull out the long stitch. These are the two lines. They are right next to each other. Let's sew the other side. With this method, you need an opening somewhere because we are going to close the top and the center back. You need an opening to turn the corset inside out. So you can either have an opening in the lining seam from here to here and sew it back with hand stitching, or you could have an opening somewhere in the bottom of the corset and just hand stitch it when you're done. I decided to use the bottom opening for this method. Next, put the lining and the main fabric right side to right side and sew the seam allowance. Sew right next to the seam allowance line, not on top of it, because if you sew on top of it, you will be sewing the bias tape and nobody wants to use a seam ripper. And I mean like nobody. So when you open it up, you see right here, you're going to see that it's not attached to the bias tape. Let's move on. Don't forget, before you start clipping the corners, make sure you sew the corners 2 to 3 times, and then you can turn the fabric inside out. Here is your final look for method 3. What do you think? Do you like it? Next is method 4. Method 4, 5, 6, and 7 is where it will start to get a little more challenging, but you got this. So put your seatbelt on because you're about to go for a ride. You ready? Let's go. The first thing we will discuss is the pattern. Method 1, 2, and 3 was a 1-piece lacing bar. This method is going to be a 2-piece lacing bar, also called a placket. With this method, you can have different color lacing bars. Let me show you how to do the pattern. Let's take this 1-piece pattern, take off the seam allowance all around it because we're going to make it a 2-piece. The first line we're going to do is 3/8, which is the boning. Then the next line will be the eyelets, which is a 1/2 inch. And then we're going to do one more boning, which is 3/8. Write your notes on the paper and cut off the placket. Then write cut on fold on the placket. Once you do that, you can put seam allowance all around both pieces except where it says cut on fold right here. This is what it looks like. You will use these pieces for this method and method 5. Now we're going to talk about how to cut the placket for method 4. Let's pretend that this is the fabric that's salvage to salvage and you have a placket. How do you cut this? You would think that you would just cut it like this, but not this time. They're going to cut it the opposite way. Take the placket and turn it this way because you want the fabric to stretch this way. There's a reason for this, and you will see in a little while, but you need it to stretch this way. So cut the fabric this way for method 4. These are your pieces, the lining, main fabric, and the placket. The reason why I told you to cut the fabric this way, it needs to stretch this way. When you steam your fabric, it has a habit of shrinking. If it shrinks, you will be upset because that means you will have to cut another piece for the placket. See this piece right here? It has to be right on the seam allowance. Believe me when I tell you, I did it years ago. I did the trial and error for you already. Also, cut the interfacing the same way. The seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. As you can see, the interfacing is 5/8 or 3/4 away from the seam allowance. The reason for that is because you don't want nothing to interfere with you turning the corners. If you have too much thickness at the corners, it will give you a problem when you turn the corners inside out. So cut your interfacing about 5/8 or 3/4, no more than 3/4, away from your 1/2 inch seam allowance. Also, do it to this piece too. This goes with the placket. Cut the interfacing 5/8 or 3/4. Next, turn the placket over and sew it a 1/2 inch on the top and the bottom. This is what it looks like. You sewed it a 1/2 inch and the interfacing is about 3/4. That's that 5/8 box. Let's cut the pieces off. You're going to cut it about 1/4. Once you turn and you feel like it's not sharp enough at the corners, use the point turner to make it a little more sharper. Next up, get a piece of boning and you're going to put it inside the placket. From there, sew a line at 3/8, but take your time sewing it. You want to push the boning all the way in so that the needle doesn't touch it. So let's sew 3/8 like this. As you can see, I'm checking the boning to see if it's still at the end. I want to make sure it stays there. Next, sew a 1/2 inch. 3/8 plus a 1/2 inch is 7/8 right here. Let's sew. Let's get another piece of boning and put it in like this. You gotta stuff it in because we don't want the needle to touch it. The casing is 3/8 and you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance right here. You could feel the boning. If you are not comfortable with this part, you can put pins to make sure the boning doesn't move. This method needs an opening somewhere to turn the corset inside out. So you could either have it open a little in the lining or the bottom of the corset. I chose the lining opening this time. Turn the lining right side to right side and sew the top and the bottom. Leave the center back open. Now bring back the placket. We're going to put it inside the center back right here. This is the reason why I said to cut the placket piece on the cross grain. You see how it has to be right on that seam allowance? If the fabric shrinks, you can stretch it out till it's on the seam allowance right here. Take the pins out and you're going to put it on top this time. The pins are to control the boning from moving when you sew because you don't want no needle to touch the boning. We don't need needles flying everywhere, you know what I mean? On top of that, you can break your sewing machine. Have you ever been sewing and you sew right on top of a needle and it pops? The first thing you do is jump back to make sure it didn't hit you. And then all you're thinking is, please, 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 I hope my sewing machine didn't break. Yeah, y'all know how it is. Let's get back to this. You see this corner? The interfacing is not on the seam allowance. So when you turn the corset inside out, it lays down better. If the corners is thick, it will not look right. Once that's all done, then you just sew the lining. Either you hand stitch it or you could use the sewing machine. I usually hand stitch it. Here is the final look for method 4. What's so nice about using a 2-piece placket is that it gives you options. You can choose which one you want to use for your design. One side is with the same fabric and the other side is with a different fabric. What side do you like? Next is method 5. Use the same pattern as method 4, but this time we are going to take off the seam allowance on the top and bottom of the corset. Take the lining and put it in the back of the main fabric, then sew it 1/4 on the top the center back and the bottom to make it one piece. Next, take the placket and put it in the back like this. We're going to sew it a 1/2 inch. Let's sew. This is what it looks like. Now what we're going to do is clip some of this off because it's too thick when we turn the placket. So cut it down 1/4. Let's talk about this placket. It has a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but you are only going to fold it 3/8. You will see why in a second. I like using white interfacing because you can write on it anytime with a pencil. Here is your 3/8. Next, you're going to steam that part. You can use pins and fold it when you're steaming, or you can use this tool that I always use too. I use both methods. This one, you just put it in and you steam it down. This is a hemming gauge. It can handle heat. Once you steam it, it will look like this. Let's fold the placket. The reason why I said fold the seam allowance 3/8 and not a 1/2 inch, it's because when you sew this to the back, the stitch will be on the back crease line. So sew this at the edge about 1/8 so that it can catch the crease line in the back. Let's sew. Here is the front and back. You see the stitches on the crease line in the back. Now, does this stitch have to be perfect? Honestly, no, it doesn't. If you sew it and it's a little bit off the crease line in the back, it's not a big deal. It's okay. It happens to me sometimes too. It's all good. Let's move on to the placket. The first line we're going to sew is 3/8, and then the next line will be a 1/2 inch. The next step is to sew the bias tape on top of your corset. Then put the boning in. After that, close the bottom with the bias tape. This is your final look for method 5. You do have options here. Option 1 is when you have the same fabric for the lacing bar. And option 2, this option you could have a different fabric. Next is method 6. This pattern is a little different. We are going to keep the one-piece panel, but we are going to make a new placket for the one piece. Take off the seam allowance on the top and bottom of the pattern and get a piece of paper. Here we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, a 1/2 inch rigiline boning 3 times, and then another 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the total will be 2.5 for the width. And for the length, make it a little longer than your center back length. These are your pieces. The first thing we're going to do is take the lining and put it in the back of the main fabric. Sew the top, the center back, and the bottom, so it becomes one. Then take the placket and put the right side of the placket to the back of the lining and sew it a 1/2 inch. Then turn the placket over to the front of the main fabric. Make sure you steam it right after this. You need it to lay flat in the front of the main fabric. Once you do that, cut off about 1/4 of this fabric. You don't want it to be too thick around this area. Next, take 3 pieces of rigiline boning and try to make them straight with your hands. Bend them back and forth. Don't use the steam because the boning will melt and it won't be straight anymore. After that, take one of the boning and put it at the corner of the placket and sew it on the edge of the rigiline boning. Sew the other side. This is what the first boning looks like. Let's go get the other one. Sew it right next to it, not on top of it. Sew the other side. After that, take the last rigiline boning and sew it the same way. This is how it looks. This is the inside and this is the back. Next, take off the extra fabric. Just follow your design lines and cut that part off. Then take the seam allowance and turn it in. You're going to feel the rigiline boning. From there, sew right on top of this stitch. The next step is to stitch the boning to the back. I'm going to show you where you should stitch. You're going to sew on top of these 2 stitches. The first line from the edge is a 1/2 inch. Then from that line to this line is a 1/2 inch. And the last line will be a 1/2 inch too. This is how the back will look. Once you do that, sew the bias tape on the top and bottom of your corset. This method gives you options for the lining. You could have the same fabric for the lining, like the main fabric, or you could have the same fabric as the placket fabric. I actually like that one better. Also, did you know that this press tool makes holes for rigiline boning and grommets? I'm so glad that I invested in it. It's so worth it. Here is the final look for method 6. You have choices again. You could use the same fabric for the placket or you could use a different fabric. Now let's get into this last method. Yes, guys, we are here finally. Thank you, Jesus. Can I get an amen up in here? All right, come on, guys. We got this. Let's do it. In this method, we're going to use the one-piece panel. This time, take off the seam allowance at the top, the center back, and the bottom. First, get a piece of paper because we're going to make a new placket. Let's do some math real quick. We need 1 3/8 for the front, 1 1/2 inch for the back, and 1/4. The total will be 3 1/8 for the width of the paper. And for the length, it has to be a little longer than your center back length. These are your pieces. You have the placket and this is the rigiline boning case. If you want to learn how to make this, I do have a video. It's called 3 Methods on How to Make a Rigiline Boning Channel. So first, let's take the lining and put it in the back of the main fabric. Sew it 1/4 on the top, the center back, and the bottom to make it a one-piece fabric. Next is the placket. What we need to do first is fold 1/4 on the back. I usually sew 1/8 of that 1/4 because when it comes to interfacing, sometimes it does things you don't want it to do. Like when you're trying to fold a small area, the interfacing might come apart from the main fabric. So what I usually do to make sure it doesn't move, I just sew right on it and then I iron the fold. Now I want to show you something. You see the front of the placket? It's a little bit smaller than the back, right? You will see in a little while why it has to be like that. But for now, let's get the rigiline boning and put it on the edge of the center back. We are going to sew this side only, not this side. Next up, trim off some of the fabric right here about 1/4. This area cannot be thick. If you are using corset mesh fabric, then it's fine. After that, take the boning and put it right on the folding line. Then sew on both edges of the boning. Let's get another boning and put it right next to the other one and sew it both sides again. This is how it's going to look. The next thing we're going to do is fold the placket. Sew on top of it 1/2 inch from the edge of the placket. Then sew another 1/2 inch from there. But first, make sure the front of the placket is about 1/8 smaller than the back. Here is a 1/2 inch. We're going to do another 1/2 inch. So the total will be 1 inch. So let's look for that 1 inch on the machine and sew. After that, take off the extra fabric you have here. If you don't know where your design line starts, then just put your pattern on top of it so you can see where you need to trim off. From there, take the edge of the rigiline bone-in tunnel and sew it right on top of that stitch. The reason why I said the front of the placket has to be about 1/8 smaller than the back, it's because the bone-in stitch has to catch the back of the fabric. This is how it's going to look when you sew right on top of that stitch. Okay, let's sew the other side. So this is what the front and back will look like. You see how you caught the stitch in the back of the placket? It's about 1/8 away from the edge. From there, put your bias tape. Here is your final look for method 7. Yay! Congratulations, everybody. Give yourself a round of applause. You stayed through the whole video. That's what I like to see, people who are eager to learn more and more. With this one, you can have the same fabric or a different fabric. Here is some champagne for you. You deserve it. What do you think? Do you like it? One side is satin fabric and the other side is corset mesh fabric. Did I hear somebody say they want one more? All right, here we go. Here's something sexy for you. One side is fabric and you guessed it, the other side is corset mesh. All right, everybody, if you want to know how to do the rigiline bone-in tunnel, here is the video and I will see you in the next video. Don't forget to practice, practice, practice. Bye, everybody.